The treehouse had always been there, a relic of another time. Built decades ago by a man who had long since disappeared, it stood deep in the woods, nestled in the arms of an ancient oak. Locals whispered about it, spinning tales of curses and disappearances, but no one truly knew its origin. They only agreed on one thing. The treehouse was a place you didn't dare go after dark. The summer that Charlie and his friends decided to explore the treehouse was unbearably hot. The kind of heat that made you restless, itching for something to break the monotony. It was Charlie's idea to venture into the woods, fueled by bravado and a nagging curiosity. There were 5 of them. Charlie, his younger brother Sam, and their 3 friends, Lily, Ben, and Eric. They were inseparable, the kind of group that shared secrets and stupid dares, but even they hesitated when they reached the base of the oak. The treehouse loomed above them, its wooden planks weathered and warped. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying faintly despite the still air. It felt alive somehow, watching them. Lily, the skeptic of the group, laughed nervously. "It's just a treehouse," she said. "Come on, it's probably full of old junk." Charlie was the first to climb the ladder, his heart pounding with each rung. The others followed reluctantly. Inside, the air was thick, carrying the scent of decayed wood and something else, something sour, metallic. The walls were scrawled with carvings, symbols none of them recognized. A small wooden chest sat in the corner, its hinges rusted and broken. Sam reached for the chest, but before he could open it, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. Eric jumped, his flashlight tumbling to the floor and flickering out. Panic rippled through the group as they scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The treehouse groaned, as though the tree itself were twisting under their weight. "Did you hear that?" Ben whispered. The others froze. At first, it was faint, a soft scratching like nails dragging across the wooden planks. Then, the sound grew louder, more insistent, circling them. Lily aimed her flashlight at the corner of the room, and they all gasped. The shadows didn't make sense. They moved independently of the light, twisting and stretching along the walls. One shadow, darker and more defined than the rest, separated from the others. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Who's there?" Charlie demanded, his voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer, but it began to move toward them, its steps silent. Panic overtook reason, and they screamed, banging on the walls and door. Sam cried out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The chest! Open the chest!" Desperation fueled his words, though he couldn't explain why he said them. Lily threw herself toward the chest, yanking it open. Inside was a single item, a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of children standing in front of the treehouse, their faces eerily familiar. "It's us," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. The children in the photograph wore their clothes, their faces identical. But behind them, barely visible, was the shadow, the same one now looming over them. The shadow reached out, its fingers impossibly long, wrapping around the edges of the photo. The air grew colder, and the treehouse began to shudder violently. A low, guttural whisper filled the space, words they couldn't understand but felt deep in their bones. Ben screamed as the floor splintered beneath him, and he vanished into the darkness below. The others tried to grab him, but it was too late. One by one, the floor gave way, swallowing them into the abyss. When Charlie opened his eyes, he was alone. The treehouse was intact, the air still and heavy. He stumbled to the door, finding it unlocked. Outside, the woods were silent, the oppressive heat replaced by an icy chill. He called for his friends, his voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. At the base of the oak, he found the photograph, now burned around the edges. The faces of his friends were gone, leaving only his own and the shadow, closer than before. He ran home, but no one remembered his friends. It was as though they had never existed. Years later, Charlie would return to the treehouse, driven by nightmares he couldn't escape. The oak was still there, its branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms, but the treehouse was gone, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Except for the photograph, which Charlie kept hidden in a drawer. And every time he looked at it, the shadow was closer. The house sat at the edge of the woods, its roof bowed under decades of moss and decay. It was known as the Whispering House, though no one really knew why. No one had lived there in over 50 years, and no one wanted to. Kids dared each other to approach it, to press an ear to its cold, splintered walls and listen for the whispers. Most didn't last more than a few seconds. The ones who did swore they heard their own names called softly from inside. One October evening, a group of teenagers, emboldened by their youth and the thrill of Halloween, decided to investigate. Emma, Ryan, Claire, and Jake were inseparable and always looking for a scare. But none of them admitted the way the house seemed to lean toward them as they approached, its empty windows like dark eyes. The door was ajar, as if inviting them in. Ryan pushed it open, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air inside was heavy, damp, and smelled of rot. The floor creaked under their weight as they stepped inside, their laughter nervous, their breath shallow. Dust motes danced in the beam of their flashlights, settling on abandoned furniture draped in filthy sheets. The first whisper came from somewhere upstairs. It was faint but distinct, a soft exhale of a word that sounded like Emma. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Probably the wind," Ryan said quickly, though his voice wavered. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. "Let's go upstairs," Jake said, more out of bravado than curiosity. Claire hesitated but followed as the others climbed the groaning staircase. The higher they went, the colder it became, and the whispers grew louder, though still unintelligible. They sounded as though they came from all around them, sliding across the walls, slipping under the floorboards. At the top of the stairs, they found a long hallway lined with closed doors. The whispers stopped suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence in their place. Emma reached for the nearest doorknob, hesitating as a chill ran down her spine. When she turned it, the door creaked open to reveal a small bedroom. The room was empty except for a mirror leaning against the far wall. Its glass was cracked, and its frame was adorned with intricate carvings of faces. At first glance, they seemed like decorations, but as the group stepped closer, the faces appeared to be screaming, their expressions frozen in terror. "Let's get out of here," Claire whispered, backing toward the door. But the door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the house. The whispers returned, louder now and distinctly angry. The group huddled together, their flashlights flickering. "Who's there?" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. The mirror answered. At first, the reflection showed only their terrified faces. But then the glass rippled like water, and another figure appeared behind them. It was tall, impossibly thin, with hollow eyes, and a mouth that seemed to stretch across its entire face. Its hands were clawed, the nails scraping against the inside of the glass as it leaned closer. Jake screamed, grabbing Emma's arm and yanking her toward the door. But when they tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The whispers became a roar, deafening and angry, the words still incomprehensible, but filled with malice. The creature in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the inside of the glass, and a crack splintered across the surface. The lights of their flashlights died completely, plunging them into darkness. Claire felt something brush against her arm, cold and skeletal. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the whispers. When the lights flickered back on, Emma was gone. The others frantically searched the room, but there was no trace of her. In the mirror, however, her face had joined the others carved into the frame, her expression frozen in a silent scream. Panic overtook them, and they fled the room, the door now inexplicably open. The house seemed to shift around them as they ran, the walls narrowing, the floors groaning as if alive. Ryan tripped on the stairs, falling hard, and when he looked up, the creature from the mirror was crouched over him, its hollow eyes staring into his. Jake and Claire didn't stop. They burst out the front door into the cold night air, the house silent behind them. When they turned back, Ryan was nowhere to be seen, and the door had closed on its own. The next morning, the house was gone. Only the foundation remained, overgrown with weeds. But at the edge of the woods, a cracked mirror leaned against a tree. Its surface was pristine, except for 3 faces staring out from the glass: Emma, Ryan, and Claire. And sometimes, if you stood close enough, you could hear whispers. There was a road on the outskirts of town, winding and narrow, bordered by dense woods on either side. Everyone called it Hollow Creek Road, though there hadn't been a creek in decades. Stories about it had circulated for years, of cars breaking down, of hitchhikers who vanished without a trace, and of a single pale figure seen in the rearview mirror just before disaster struck. It was said that no one who walked Hollow Creek Road after midnight ever came back. Nathan didn't believe in any of it. He had always prided himself on being a skeptic, the type to scoff at ghost stories and urban legends. So when his friends dared him to walk the length of Hollow Creek Road at midnight, he laughed and accepted without hesitation. That night he arrived at the road just as the clock struck 12. The air was unusually cold for autumn, and a thick fog hung low to the ground. The woods were eerily silent, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves absent. Nathan checked his phone. It had no signal. Typical. He started walking. The first mile was uneventful. The trees on either side seemed unnaturally tall, their branches arching overhead like a canopy, blocking out the moonlight. His flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the cracked asphalt. Every so often he thought he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was only the empty road stretching into the fog. By the second mile he began to feel uneasy. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on him like a weight. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and the fog seemed to be moving, swirling in patterns that didn't make sense. He shook his head, trying to laugh off his nerves. "It's just a road," he muttered to himself, "just an old, creepy road." Then he heard it, a faint sound, like whispering, carried on the wind. It was too soft to make out the words, but it sent a chill down his spine. He quickened his pace, glancing nervously over his shoulder. There was still nothing behind him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the woods, from just beyond the edge of the road. Against his better judgment, he shined his flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated the gnarled trunks and tangled underbrush, but nothing else. He exhaled, relief flooding through him, until he noticed something in the corner of his eye. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the light. It was pale and indistinct, almost blending into the fog. Nathan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. He turned and ran. The road seemed longer now, stretching endlessly in both directions. The whispers followed him, growing louder, overlapping until they were almost a scream. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the presence behind him growing closer with every step. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. He stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, his ears straining for any sound. That's when he felt it, a cold breath on the back of his neck. Nathan spun around, but there was no one there. The fog had thickened, swirling around him like a living thing. He fumbled for his phone, desperate for light, for anything, but the screen was dead. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw the figure again, closer this time. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its face smooth and featureless, except for two hollow black eyes. It tilted its head as if studying him, and then it began to move, not walking, but gliding toward him, its feet never touching the ground. Nathan screamed and bolted neck, the sound tearing from his throat as he ran faster than he ever had before. The thing was behind him. He could feel it, hear it, a soft scraping sound, like claws dragging along the pavement. When he saw the headlights, he thought he was saved. A car was approaching, its beams cutting through the fog. He stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. The car slowed, its tires crunching against the gravel. But as it drew closer, Nathan's relief turned to horror. The driver's face was wrong. Their eyes were too wide, their smile too sharp, stretching impossibly from ear to ear. The car stopped just inches away, and the door opened slowly. The driver stepped out, their movements jerky, unnatural. Nathan turned to run, but the figure from the woods was there, blocking his path. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling his ears, his mind, until he could no longer think. The last thing he saw was the driver's impossibly wide grin as they reached out for him. Nathan never returned from Hollow Creek Road. His friends searched for him the next day, but all they found was his phone lying in the middle of the road, its screen cracked and dead. And sometimes late at night, drivers on Hollow Creek Road swear they see a figure standing in the fog, watching them with hollow, black eyes. The storm rolled in quickly that night, a wall of wind and rain sweeping across the sleepy town. Sarah had just finished her shift at the diner and was driving home on the back roads, her car's wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The radio crackled with static, and her phone had lost service miles ago. She cursed herself for taking the shortcut, but it was late, and she wanted to get home. The road was deserted, bordered on both sides by dense forest. The rain made it hard to see, but something up ahead caught her eye, a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and hunched over. As she got closer, she could make out details. A woman in a pale dress, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. She wasn't waving or signaling for help. She was just standing there, staring down at the ground. Sarah hesitated but slowed down, her headlights illuminating the woman. Rolling down her window slightly, she called out, "Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look up. Sarah felt a pang of unease but reasoned that maybe the woman was in shock. With a sigh, she pulled over, grabbing her umbrella from the passenger seat. The rain hit her like a wall as she stepped out, the cold biting through her jacket. "Hey," Sarah said, approaching cautiously. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere?" The woman finally looked up and Sarah froze. Her face was pale, almost gray, her eyes sunken and hollow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then Sarah noticed her hands. Her fingers were long and bony, the nails blackened and cracked. She was clutching something small and dark in her palm. I need," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Sarah leaned closer, straining to hear, when the woman's head snapped toward her with unnatural speed. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's, and a guttural, inhuman growl rose from her throat. Sarah stumbled back, her umbrella dropping to the ground. She turned and ran to her car, slipping on the wet pavement as the growling grew louder, closer. She threw herself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, fumbling with the lock. Her hands shook as she turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the woman was gone. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes darting between the mirrors and the dark woods. The rain was deafening, pounding against the roof of the car. Suddenly, there was a loud thud. Something had hit the back of her car. Sarah's stomach dropped as she glanced in the rearview mirror, but the back window was too fogged up to see. Another thud, louder this time, shook the car. Heart pounding, she threw the car into drive and sped off, the tires skidding on the wet road. She didn't stop until she reached her driveway, the lights of her house a beacon in the storm. Throwing the car into park, she bolted for the front door, not daring to look back. Once inside, she locked every door and window, her hands trembling as she turned off the lights. Safe inside, she let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince herself it was just some strange, delusional woman. But deep down, she couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. As she moved to close the curtains, lightning flashed, illuminating her yard for a brief moment. In that instant, she saw the woman standing at the edge of the woods, her pale dress fluttering in the storm. Sarah stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. The room plunged into darkness again as the lightning faded. She stood frozen, staring out the window, waiting for another flash. When it came, the woman was closer, standing just at the edge of the porch. Sarah backed away, fumbling for her phone, but it was still dead. She ran to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, and grabbed the old landline phone she kept for emergencies. The line was filled with static, and she could barely make out the operator's voice. "Hello? I need help," Sarah cried into the receiver. "What's your emergency?" The voice replied, distorted and strange. "There's someone outside my house," she shouted. The voice on the other end went silent for a moment before whispering, "She's already inside." The line went dead. Sarah turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. In the corner of the room, barely illuminated by the flashing storm outside, stood the woman. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. The last thing Sarah saw before the lights went out completely was the woman's face splitting into a jagged, unnatural smile. The little antique shop was the kind of place people walked past without a second glance. Its dusty windows displayed mismatched trinkets, faded books, and odd-looking dolls. But what drew Maria inside that day was the mirror. It was massive, standing over 7 feet tall, with an ornate golden frame carved to resemble twisting vines and blooming flowers. Something about it seemed alive, almost hypnotic. The mirror's glass shimmered, unusually pristine for such an old piece, and when Maria looked into it, her reflection seemed off. It wasn't her appearance. Her face, her clothes, everything was the same. But her reflection lingered just a fraction of a second longer than it should when she moved, as though it were catching up to her. The shop owner, a frail old man with a thin, crooked smile, noticed her staring. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice raspy. "Came from an estate auction. They say it's from the 1800s. Quite the history." Maria didn't care about its history. All she could think about was how much it would look perfect in her living room. When the man offered it at a price far lower than she expected, she didn't hesitate. Later that evening, she stood in her apartment, admiring the mirror as it leaned against the wall. The golden frame seemed even more intricate under the warm glow of her lamps, and the glass reflected the room perfectly, almost too perfectly. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow pass across the reflection, but when she turned, there was nothing there. She chalked it up to exhaustion and went to bed. That night, the dreams started. Maria found herself standing in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back with unblinking eyes. She tried to move, but her reflection stayed perfectly still, its face expressionless. Then it began to smile. It wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, too wide, showing too many teeth. The reflection raised a hand, and Maria felt an icy grip on her own wrist, though she hadn't moved. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The mirror loomed in the darkness of her living room, its surface catching the faint glow of streetlights through the window. She told herself it was just a nightmare, but sleep didn't come easily after that. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Items in her apartment would be out of place when she returned from work. A book she was certain she'd left on the coffee table would be on the floor, pages bent. Lights flickered whenever she walked past the mirror, and sometimes out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in the glass. Just a flicker, like something shifting in the background. One evening, Maria decided she'd had enough. She threw a sheet over the mirror and went to bed early, determined to get some sleep. But the dreams returned. This time, her reflection wasn't alone. Shadowy figures stood behind it, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They whispered in low, guttural voices, words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her chest. Her reflection's cold smile grew wider as the whispers grew louder, filling her head until she woke up screaming. The sheet covering the mirror was gone. Maria's heart pounded as she stared at the uncovered glass. Her reflection was there, but it was wrong. Its eyes were black, voids that seemed to pull her in. Slowly, it raised a hand, beckoning her closer. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. Her feet moved on their own, drawn toward the mirror. The surface rippled like water as her hand reached out, and she felt a cold, unyielding grip pull her forward. The next morning, Maria's neighbor knocked on her door, concerned after hearing screams in the night. When no one answered, they called the police. The apartment was empty. Maria was gone, but the mirror remained, now reflecting a living room no longer there. If you were to look closely at the glass, you might see her. She's still there, trapped just behind the surface, her face frozen in a silent scream. And sometimes when the light hits it just right, you can see the shadowy figures surrounding her, watching, waiting for the next curious soul to come too close. The old farmhouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. Everyone in the small town knew better than to go near it. That place is cursed, people would say, lowering their voices as if the house itself might overhear. But Kayla, always chasing the thrill of the unknown, wasn't one to believe in curses. It was a dare, of course, a stupid Halloween bet. Spend one night in the farmhouse, take some pictures, that and prove nothing sinister was there. Easy money, or so she thought. Armed with her phone, a flashlight, and a sleeping bag, Kayla arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wind howled as she pushed the creaking front door open, revealing a grand staircase covered in dust and cobwebs. The air smelled of mildew and rot, heavy and oppressive. She set up in what used to be the living room, laying her sleeping bag on the warped wooden floor. Above the fireplace hung a cracked mirror, its edges stained black with age. Kayla didn't like the way it caught the dim light from her flashlight, reflecting it in strange ways. She turned it toward the wall, her fingers trembling slightly, though she wouldn't admit it to herself. Hours passed. The wind outside screamed through broken windows, rattling loose shutters. Kayla tried to distract herself, scrolling through her phone, but the reception was non-existent. She snapped a few pictures of the decaying interior, the flash momentarily illuminating shadows that seemed too dark, too thick. Around midnight, the house grew unnaturally silent. No wind, no creaking floorboards, nothing. Just silence. Kayla tried to shake off the unease and climbed into her sleeping bag. The dare was almost over, and she was determined to win. Just as her eyes began to close, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from above her. She shined her flashlight toward the ceiling, her breath caught in her throat. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone were walking directly above her. The second floor. Probably just an animal, she whispered to herself, though her voice sounded hollow in the stillness. She tried to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was just at the top of the stairs. Summoning her courage, Kayla grabbed her flashlight and crept toward the staircase. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking. The beam of light wavered as her hand trembled. No response. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark void of the second floor. Finally, she turned to go back to her sleeping bag, but that's when she heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably her name. "Kayla?" Her blood turned to ice. She spun around, aiming her flashlight toward the top of the stairs, but there was nothing there. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it were right behind her. Her. "Kayla?" She bolted back to the living room, her heart pounding. She grabbed her bag, ready to leave, but froze when she saw the mirror. It had turned itself back around, its cracked surface facing her. She swore she'd left it turned to the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. But as she stepped closer, she realized it wasn't copying her movements. Her reflection stood still, its mouth slowly curling into a sinister smile. Then it moved. Kayla screamed as the reflection reached out of the mirror, its hand impossibly long, its fingers clawed and dripping with black ichor. She stumbled backward, but the thing kept coming, dragging itself out of the glass with jerking, unnatural movements. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the floor and swinging it wildly. The thing laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in her skull. She ran. The front door slammed shut as she approached, locking her inside. The thing was behind her, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, its laughter filling the air. She fled upstairs, her only option, and barricaded herself in a small bedroom. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from all around her. Her flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. The last thing she saw before the light went out completely was the mirror in the corner of the room, its surface rippling like water. Something moved inside it, pressing against the glass, trying to break through. Kayla's screams were swallowed by the house, the sound fading into the cold, suffocating silence. The next morning, the house was quiet again, empty, as always. The locals noticed her car still parked out front, but found no trace of Kayla. Weeks later, a group of teens ventured into the farmhouse on a dare. In the living room, they found the cracked mirror, untouched except for one detail. In its reflection, they saw Kayla, her face pale and distorted, her mouth open in a soundless scream, and when they turned to look behind them, she wasn't there. The town of Black Hollow had one peculiar rule. No one went into the cornfield after sunset. No one really talked about why, but everyone obeyed. Parents passed the rule down to their children, and kids grew up knowing that the rows of tall, rustling stalks weren't to be disturbed at night. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it was cursed. Whatever the truth, people whispered stories of those who had ignored the warning. None of them ended well. Elliot didn't believe in ghost stories. A newcomer to the town, he laughed at the local superstition. Cornfields were just cornfields, he told himself. Nothing more. So, when he found himself driving past Black Hollow's infamous field late one evening, headlights cutting through the misty darkness, he decided to prove how ridiculous the whole thing was. Parking his car at the edge of the field, he grabbed his phone and flashlight and stepped into the rows. The air felt colder here, the silence deeper. The cornstalks loomed high above him, their dry leaves whispering faintly in the wind. He brushed off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine and turned on his flashlight. "Just a field," he muttered, the beam of light bouncing off the rows of corn. "What's the big deal?" As he walked deeper into the field, the tall stalks seemed to close in around him. The moonlight barely filtered through the gaps, and soon the faint outline of his car was lost behind him. He glanced at his phone. No signal, of course. It wasn't until he heard the footsteps that he stopped. At first, he thought it was his imagination. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot could have been the wind or an animal. But then he realized the sound was perfectly in sync with his own steps. When he stopped, it stopped. When he moved, it moved. Elliot swung his flashlight around, but the rows stretched endlessly in every direction. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead before the light was swallowed by the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. No answer. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. "It's just the wind," he said, louder, as if to convince himself. He kept walking, but now his pace quickened. The footsteps behind him quickened too. Panic began to set in. Elliot broke into a run, crashing through the stalks, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The footsteps were louder now, closer. He turned his head, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing there, just rows and rows of corn. Then he heard the whispering. It started softly, like the rustling of leaves, but grew louder and more distinct with every step. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, accusing, hungry. Elliot's chest heaved as he sprinted, his flashlight flickering. He didn't know where he was going. Every direction looked the same. The rows of corn seemed to shift and twist, leading him in circles. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage. "Let me out!" he screamed, but the field swallowed his voice. The flashlight died, plunging him into darkness. He stumbled, falling to his knees. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding him, closing in. He felt the cornfield breathe, its stalks pressing against him like cold, skeletal hands. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent. The air was still. Elliot knelt in the dirt, trembling, the only sound his ragged breathing. He fumbled for his phone, its screen casting a faint glow in the blackness. And that's when he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, staring at him from between the stalks. They glowed faintly, like embers, unblinking and unhuman. Slowly, the eyes moved closer, the shadows around them taking shape. Figures emerged from the corn, tall, gaunt, and twisted, their faces hollow and stretched, mouths hanging open in soundless screams. Elliot stumbled backward, his phone slipping from his grasp. The figures moved closer, their long limbs dragging through the dirt. One of them raised a bony hand, pointing at him, and the whispers began again, low and rhythmic, chanting something ancient and dark. The last thing Elliot saw before the darkness consumed him was the cornfield itself moving, the stalks twisting together to pull him deeper into its grasp. The next morning, Elliot's car was found abandoned by the side of the road. His phone lay in the dirt near the edge of the field, its screen cracked and smeared with dirt. No one ever saw him again. But sometimes, late at night, people driving past the cornfield swear they see a figure standing just inside the rows, watching, waiting. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, a white wall swallowing the winding mountain road. Jamie had been driving for hours, the warmth of her car heater barely keeping the chill at bay. The radio crackled with static, and her phone had no signal this deep in the wilderness. She cursed herself for not checking the weather before leaving. The road was slick with ice, and the visibility was nearly zero. She needed to find shelter. Fast. Her headlights caught a sign just off the road. "Shh, Hollow Pines Motel, vacancy," with an arrow pointing down a narrow driveway. Relieved, she turned in, her tires crunching over the snow. The motel was a shabby, single-story building with faded paint and a flickering neon open sign. The parking lot was empty. Jamie hesitated. The place looked like the setting of a bad horror movie, but the storm was getting worse, and she didn't have a choice. Inside the lobby, the air was stale and cold. A bell sat on the counter, and Jamie tapped it, the sharp ding echoing through the empty room. After a moment, a man emerged from the back office. He was older, with sunken eyes and a thin, unsettling smile. "Just you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Jamie nodded, hugging herself against the chill. "Yeah, just me. Do you have a room?" He slid a key across the counter, his hand lingering for a moment. "Room 6. End of the hall. Don't leave the room after midnight," he said, his tone oddly serious. Jamie forced a laugh, thinking it was a joke. "Why? The boogeyman comes out?" The man didn't laugh. He just stared at her, his dark eyes unblinking. "Just don't." She took the key, muttering a quiet thanks, and hurried down the dimly lit hallway. The motel smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet squelched slightly under her boots, as if it had soaked up years of dampness. Room 6 was at the very end, sealed up, its door scratched and scuffed. She pushed it open. The room was exactly what she expected: a sagging bed, outdated wallpaper, and a buzzing fluorescent light. The only window faced the parking lot, offering a view of the snowstorm raging outside. She locked the door, propped a chair under the handle for good measure, and collapsed onto the bed. Despite the thin walls and the storm outside, the motel was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jamie turned on the TV for some noise, but all she got was static. With a sigh, she turned it off and decided to try to sleep. Sometime after midnight, a sound woke her. It was faint at first, a soft scratching, like nails dragging against wood. Her eyes darted to the chair wedged under the door handle. It hadn't moved. She told herself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Scratch! Scratch! It was coming from the window. Jamie's breath hitched. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of something on the other side, pressing against the glass. Slowly, she reached for her phone, but of course there was no signal. She stayed perfectly still, her heart hammering, as the scratching continued. Then, the whispering started. It was low, almost inaudible, but it was definitely a voice. A woman's voice, rasping and broken. "Let me in," it whispered, over and over. "Let me in." Jamie wanted to scream, but her throat felt paralyzed. She didn't dare move. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was a wail, a desperate, keening cry that filled the room. The window rattled violently, as if something was trying to break through. Jamie grabbed the lamp from the bedside table, ready to defend herself, but just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell silent again, save for her ragged breathing. She didn't sleep after that. She sat on the bed, clutching the lamp, staring at the window until the faint light of dawn crept through the curtains. When the sun finally rose, she threw on her coat and bolted for the lobby, ready to demand answers. The man at the desk was waiting, his sunken eyes watching her closely. "Rough night?" he asked, as if he already knew. "What the hell happened last night?" Jamie demanded, her voice trembling. "There was someone, or something, outside my window." The man sighed, leaning on the counter. "You didn't open the window, did you?" "Of course not," she snapped. He nodded slowly. "Good. They always knock first, and if you let them in, you don't leave." Jamie stared at him, horrified. Without another word, she grabbed her keys and ran to her car. The snow had stopped, and the road was clear enough to drive. She didn't look back as she sped away from the motel, her tires skidding on the icy pavement. It wasn't until she stopped at a gas station hours later that she noticed it. On the backseat window of her car, faint but unmistakable, were 3 long, deep scratches. Deep in the forest of Ravenswood, there was a trail no one dared to follow, a narrow, winding path known as the stark, silent hollow. The name came from the unnatural stillness that hung over it. Birds didn't sing there. The wind didn't rustle the leaves. Even footsteps seemed muted. The locals told stories about it, how people who ventured down the trail often didn't come back. Those who did were never the same. Their eyes hollow and their voices shaking as they refused to say what they'd seen. Jake, of course, didn't believe any of it. He was a skeptic, a thrill seeker. When his friends dared him to spend a night in Silent Hollow, he laughed. "It's just a forest," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" The moon was full the night Jake entered the hollow. The trees towered over him like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches blocking out most of the light. He carried a flashlight, but its beam seemed weaker here, as if the darkness was thicker, heavier. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owls, the rustle of small animals, faded until there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Even that seemed muffled. Hours passed. Jake set up a small campsite in a clearing and lit a fire. The flames crackled, but the sound was oddly dull. He tried to shake off the growing unease, chalking it up to his imagination. But then he noticed something strange. The fire didn't cast any shadows. He waved his hand in front of the flames, expecting to see his shadow flicker across the ground. But there was nothing, just the dull glow of the firelight on the trees. Jake's unease turned to dread. He tried to tell himself it was some strange natural phenomenon, but deep down he knew something was wrong. He decided to pack up and leave. But as he stood, he heard it. A low, guttural hum. It came from the trees, resonating through the still air. It wasn't like any sound Jake had ever heard, deep and rhythmic, like a voice but not quite human. It grew louder, closer, until it surrounded him. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. The hum stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then something moved at the edge of the clearing. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct and shifting. But as Jake's eyes adjusted, he saw it was no shadow. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, smooth as polished stone. Jake froze. The thing stood there, motionless, staring at him with no eyes. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed. The fire went out. Jake didn't think. He ran. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as he tore through the trees, his breath coming in panicked gasps. The forest seemed endless, the trail he'd come in on now impossible to find. He could hear the thing behind him, its steps unnaturally slow but always close. He glanced over his shoulder and wished he hadn't. The figure wasn't running. It didn't need to. It moved in flickers, disappearing and reappearing closer and closer, as if the darkness itself carried it forward. Jake tripped, sprawling onto the cold, damp ground. His flashlight rolled away, its beam illuminating the figure standing just feet from him. For the first time, it made a sound, a low, rattling breath that sent shivers down his spine. "Leave," it said, the word barely more than a growl. Its voice was hollow, layered, as if a dozen mouths spoke in unison. Jake scrambled to his feet and ran again, his lungs burning, his legs screaming with exhaustion. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, he saw it, the faint outline of the forest's edge. He burst through the tree line, collapsing onto the dirt road. The moment he crossed, the oppressive silence lifted. He could hear the wind, the distant calls of birds, but when he looked back, the trail was gone. The trees had shifted, the entrance to Silent Hollow swallowed by the forest. Jake didn't tell anyone what happened that night. He left Ravenswood the next morning, vowing never to return. But sometimes when he's alone at night, he hears it, the low, guttural hum. And he knows deep down that the hollow hasn't forgotten him. It was a cold, rainy night when Emma's car broke down on a desolate stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. Her phone was dead, of course, because that's how these things always went. Frustrated and drenched, she pulled her coat tighter and started walking, hoping to find a gas station or a house with someone who could help. After about a mile, she spotted it, a faint light flickering through the rain. As she got closer, she saw it was a large house, Victorian, weathered and looming against the night sky. The windows were dark, except for one on the second floor, glowing dimly. Emma hesitated. The house looked abandoned, but the light suggested someone might be there. Desperation won over caution. The front door creaked open before she even knocked. "Hello?" she called, stepping inside. Her voice echoed in the cavernous space. The interior was just as old and eerie as the exterior. Dusty furniture, cobwebs, and an overwhelming smell of damp wood. She called out again, but no one answered. She should have turned around right then and there, but the warmth inside was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. The light upstairs beckoned. Maybe someone was there. Maybe they'd help. She climbed the grand staircase, her wet boots squeaking against the worn wood. The air grew colder the higher she went, and the feeling of being watched settled heavy on her shoulders. She tried to shake it off. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness, except for the faint glow spilling out from a room at the end. The door was ajar. Emma approached slowly, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The room was small, almost bare, except for a single rocking chair near the window. The chair creaked softly, swaying back and forth, though no one was in it. A dim oil lamp sat on the windowsill, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emma froze. Something about the room felt wrong. The air was heavy and the silence was oppressive. Then she saw it, a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. Its surface was fogged as though someone had just breathed on it. But when Emma wiped the glass, her blood ran cold. Her reflection wasn't alone. Behind her, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and sunken, her eyes black as coal. Emma spun around, but the doorway was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the woman was still there, only now she was closer. Emma stumbled backward, her breath hitching. The woman's lips moved silently, forming words Emma couldn't hear. Then the mirror's surface began to ripple. like water disturbed by a stone. Emma didn't wait to see what would happen next. She bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly as the shadows closed in around her. The faint creak of the rocking chair followed her, growing louder with every step. She reached the staircase and stumbled down, nearly falling in her panic. The front door loomed ahead, but just as she reached for it, it slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. "Please!" she screamed, pounding on the door. The house responded with silence. And then, the whispering started. It came from all around her, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. A dozen voices overlapping, rising and falling in a chilling, incomprehensible chant. Emma turned, pressing her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move, writhing and shifting, as if alive. Then, one by one, the figures emerged. Pale, sunken-eyed forms, their faces twisted in anguish. They crept toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural. Emma's screams filled the house, but outside, the night remained silent. The rain poured on, masking the faint flicker of light that now glowed from every window of the old house. The next morning, her car was still there, stranded on the roadside, but Emma was gone. The house stood silent and empty, just as it always had. Local legends grew, of course. Some said the house only appeared to those who were lost, luring them in with promises of shelter before trapping them forever. Others swore they'd seen a figure standing in the window late at night, a young woman staring out with empty eyes, as if waiting for someone to join her.